revision. Okay, so with revision, I said we're going to go through the 2021 paper. I saw there was a few of you that did attend the Saturday class where they went through the 2019 paper. And yeah, there was some questions which were in that paper that's not going to be relevant to you. One of them was the sorting algorithm. So I did mention that sorting algorithms are not going to be something that's going to be in the test tomorrow. Not to say that it might not be in the supplementary test, not to say that it won't be in the exam, but in tomorrow's test, there will not be sorting algorithms. Now, there's a couple of differences between this paper and the paper you're writing tomorrow. We did cover those differences on Friday, but I'll just talk about it again. Your paper that you're writing tomorrow is only 60 minutes. And that's because of the venue constraints that we have, and out of 50 marks. So it's not going to be exactly the same as this paper. However, the content inside, mostly the same. This was an open book test. You do not have that opportunity tomorrow. It's not an open book test. No textbook, anything allowed in the venue. You only write with the paper that's given in front of you. So all of these things about uploading online, that's not going to be relevant to us, so we don't have to worry about that. In terms of the structure, your test tomorrow is going to be 5 questions. The first 3 questions are 10 marks each. All of them are theory. 4th question is 5 marks, also theory. And the last question is 15 marks, and that's your practical. So it's going to be a bit of a different structure to the paper that you see right now. But in terms of the content, most of it is going to be the same. Okay, so your homework, as we say, is going through this actual paper. So hopefully you've done that. Who has actually gone through the paper? Okay, so a few of you. And the rest of you, you know everything. So you're going to get 100% tomorrow, right? Then why didn't you go through the paper? What's the point of not doing it? Because tomorrow, I'm not going to be there reading out the answers to you like I'm now. Tomorrow, you writing the answers. That's what you get marks for. Okay, so we start off with the easy stuff. This is 3 marks because that's what it is. It's easy questions. So first question, analyze the code segment and answer the questions that follow. Write down only the question number and the answer. Only write down what is asked of you. Don't do more. You only get marks for what we asked, not more. So we are in question A, sub-question I. Which programming language category does the code segment belong to? I told you, I'm asking you the answer first. So anyone want to give their answer? That's an immediate wrong. What did I say? It's B. If you say high level, you're not answering the question properly, because what did I say? Write down the letter that corresponds to the multiple choice. That's the correct answer. Now, I'm not that strict where I'll mark it wrong, but you didn't follow instructions. Make sure you read the question and follow the instructions. So, who says A? Hands up. Who says A? Okay, hands up. Who says B? Answers B. Why? It's not part of the question there, but I'm asking you now. Why?
Syntax is different. There's out of compiled code. You can see that they aren't using method block brackets to declare their methods or their classes.
Nope. Low-level languages don't have things like classes. Low-level languages don't have things like if statements. Low-level languages don't have things like for loops. Alphanumeric codes, and that's it. That's all that low-level languages have. So we're not talking about whether it's machine code, assembly, all of those subcategories. We're talking about is it high-level or low-level. You need to identify that. Now, you've seen something similar to this. What code is that? There's an example in the slides. So what code is this? It's Python. That's on the slides, example of the code, that's Python. I don't expect you to know the full syntax of Python, but you should be able to recognize that this is not C++, this is not Java. Okay, so now the next one, that's a bit of a tricky one. Maybe this one's not so much 3 marks. You have to guess which programming language category it belongs to, subcategory. Now, if you don't know that it's Python, you might choose the wrong one, but we'll come back to that. So, which subcategory does this belong to? D, interpreted. Now, if you know it's Python, you would have remembered on the slide, Python was an interpreted language. Okay, so if you got that wrong, let's say you chose the wrong thing. Let's say you chose C or you chose E. Let's look at the next question. Next question says, provide one property of the programming language category. So you need to talk about the category that was chosen. And if you give the correct information, even though you got sub-question 2 wrong, you still get a mark for that. So even though you might have got one wrong answer there, if you could provide the correct information about that category and subcategory, you will get a mark for that. So property of interpreted languages, you have to distribute source code, it's a bit slower. Anything else? All in the slides, there's plenty of things that you can discuss there. Say again? Heavy performance penalty because it has to be interpreted, because it's not compiled, it has to be run line by line. So any other things that were discussed on those points? So now, if you said, for example, it's a compiled language, you can talk about the compilation, you can talk about any of the points there for compiled, any of the points for bytecode interpreted. You can talk about the source code not being distributed, platform independence, those type of things for all different sections. So it's not we just mark it wrong and everything is wrong afterwards. We do see that you follow through and give the right answers afterwards. Okay. So this goes for the rest of the questions that go on. If we see that you might have got the first part of the question wrong, but the second part you justified with the correct thing, we do mark through. We don't just give everything naught. We do actually go and mark through. That's assuming you write something. And I said this on Friday as well. Answer all your questions. Make sure you answered all the questions. You get a question paper in front of you. Tick off that you answered the question. Carry on to the next one. Make sure that you answered everything, because if you leave out a question, you lose all the marks for that specific question. Next part, we're looking at the Java language. So you'll see that here there is names for the questions, or categories for the questions that pertain to what's happening in the slides and also then to the textbook. So now we're talking about the Java language as a whole. The Java C command line program is used during the process of writing Java application. What are the inputs to this program? So input or inputs, what are the inputs to Java C? Java source code. You provide Java source code to the compiler. It's a compiler, it needs source code. If you mention text, that's wrong. We're not giving text, we're giving source code. Very big difference there. What are the outputs of this program? You can answer later. I want someone else to answer. Yes. Compiled class files or bytecode? So you could say class files, you can say bytecode, both of those will give you the correct answer. But this is just one type of question I could be asking. I could be asking the same thing. Instead of asking Java C, what other command line tools have you used when you're writing code? Java. What does that do? It runs your code. And I could ask what's the inputs and outputs for that. Java doc, same thing. I could ask what's the inputs and outputs for that. Okay, on to the next question. Discuss the relationship between primitive types and the associated rapid types. Provide an example for each. Now, this is an interesting question because while we discussed it in class, I didn't talk about code in depth. So where do you find this information? Textbook. Because I'm not going to put every single thing in the textbook onto the slides. I can't do that. That's not feasible. But we did discuss it, and I did show some code for that in the actual lecture as well. So primitive types and rapid types. What is a primitive type? What is the primitive type? The same people answering, so I'm expecting them to pass.
It's a fixed length variable stored on the stack in the Java language.
Okay, so it's a fixed length value stored on the stack. So, okay, and examples of them?
Int, long, double, string. Oh no, not string, well, not string.
Okay, so you were right there, and then you went down the wrong path at the end there. So things like integers, ints, int, boolean, boolean, small lowercase b, double, lowercase d. Why am I making a point about lowercase? Because for each primitive type, there is a wrapper type, and that wrapper type is a class type. So primitive types are fixed length values. You can mention heap and stack, doesn't really matter too much about that, but they are fixed length values. You can mention things like integer being so many bytes. Where do you get that information from? So there, in the column that's in orange, you can see that's the primitive types. Except for the last one, that's object references, so that wouldn't be counting as a primitive type. But then you can see there's a column calling wrapper type, and the wrapper classes are the same name as the primitive type, except it's a reference to that thing. It's a class that represents that data structure. So with Boolean capital B, it's a Boolean class that represents the same values that a Boolean lowercase b can represent. An example of that, all you have to do is give me an example where you create a new instance of one of those classes, passing the appropriate data type into it. When answering a question, always look at the mark allocation to see where the marks are distributed. I'm asking two things and two examples. So for every part of the question, so primitive type, what is a primitive type? 1 mark. What is a rapid type? 1 mark. Example of primitive type, 1 mark. Example of rapid type, 1 mark. So there are situations where maybe you get the definition incorrect, but you get the example correct. It does happen. You still get marks for that. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Discuss. Okay, that's a typo there. Discuss when a for each loop should be used over a for loop. Discuss when a for each loop should be used over a for loop. Just to remind you what that looks like. So that's a normal for loop. Let's just zoom in here. So that's a normal for loop, and that's a for each loop. So when would I use the second one as opposed to the first one? Say again? I can do contents of an object with both loops. You have to tell me why you're going to choose one over the other. What do you mean by more power?
So I mean, like, for example, when it's outputs, it's
Okay, so that's not on the right track yet. Okay, so the one argument might be that if I want to iterate for a certain amount of times, I use a normal for loop, and if I want to loop for an unknown amount of times, I can use the for each loop. Okay, so if we look at the question, you look at the mark allocation, it's 2 marks. If you give an answer like that, you'll get 1 mark, not 2. Anyone else?
also when you need to know the index of content you are accessing.
There we go. The answer that we're looking for is, in the first example, you need to work with the index in some way. Obviously, not exactly this code. I'm not really caring about this code. But if you're iterating over something and you care about the index where that thing occurs, then you would use a normal for loop. If you don't, and I'm just iterating over something, maybe to write it to a file, maybe to output it onto the screen, then I can use the for each loop. Because I don't need to initialize another variable, that variable k there, I don't need to initialize that if I'm not going to use it. Does that make sense? I see some people nodding and I see some people doing this. If you don't need a variable, don't initialize it, don't declare it, don't use it. So the major point here, if you need an iterator variable, do I need that variable k in the for loop? If I need it, use the normal for loop. If I don't, use the for each loop. But with a for each loop, you can only use things that are collections. When we get to generics, we'll talk about collections in more detail, but an array fits into that category perfectly fine. Your custom class that you write that looks like an array has to implement the correct interface to work like that. So that's some extra things to keep in mind. Now, the answer you're looking for was that k, if you're using that value k in that example. Provide Java source code to display the first command line argument of a Java application. So here I'm asking for 1 line of code. Don't write me a whole main method. Don't write me a whole main class with a main method. Just give me 1 line of code that will output the first command line argument of a Java application. So where do I get that first command line argument? In the main, what fast is the parameter? Args. How do you get the first element out of the args array? Square brackets, 0. So just getting that arg square bracket 0, that's 1 mark. The other mark, displaying that. How do you display it? System out, print line, system out print. That's your other mark. 2 marks. Easy? I hope so. So there can be questions like this where I ask you about displaying something, asking about the input and output streams, input output error streams. But it will just be 1 line of code. Again, look at the mark allocation. Here, 2 things displaying, and what are you displaying? That's your 2 marks. If it's only 1 mark, it's probably only 1 thing I'm asking for. So the full code that I was looking for. So this can be print or print line, and then so that should be a full answer. Now, if you forget the semicolon, we don't really care. So what you get marks for is this 1 mark, and then that 1 mark. Okay, so next question. Now we're looking at object orientation, and note it doesn't say basic, advanced. It's going to all be mixed together. How does a Java programmer force a method to be implemented in a subclass? How does a Java programmer force a method to be implemented in a subclass? I'm sure there was more than 3 people that put up their hands when they said they did this test, practice test. But now I'm only seeing one person raise their hand answering questions. Okay, so one answer we got was using interface that in the superclass that the child class has to implement. Okay, we'll come back to that. Anyone else with another answer? Okay, so there's two options here. You can have a superclass that implements an interface, and that interface has to be implemented in a concrete child class. That's one method. The other method is to have an abstract class with an abstract method, and then have the child class implement that abstract class, and then has to implement that abstract method. So there's two options that you can take there. Either way you take it, that's where your mark gets distributed. So you have to talk about having abstract methods, but both of them have abstract methods. One is through an interface, one is through an abstract class. And then the child class has to be concrete for it to be forced to implement that specific thing. Okay, moving on to the next one. Describe the differences between method overloading and method overriding. Now, when you answer these types of questions that says discuss the difference or compare or give the advantages of this over the other one, if you just give definitions, method overloading is this, method overriding is this, you will not get your full marks because you are not doing a difference. You're not explaining what the difference is. You're providing definitions. You need to discuss what is the differences, not just the definitions. If we say compare, don't tell me the one thing is this and then tell me completely separately the other thing is that. You have to talk about them together. Okay, any answers for this? Okay, so again, I heard more of definitions than comparisons. You need to talk about the differences more than that. So the answer is there. It is going to be correct in the way that the pieces that you have, but the way you're explaining it is not correct. You're just talking about definitions. Anything different on this side? Okay, so one thing that you can mention that's going to be a difference is the structure of the method signature. Overloading has to be the same structure. Overriding has to be, overriding has to be the same structure. Overloading has to be a different structure for the method signature. The other thing that's an important difference, overloading occurs in the same class. Overriding occurs between superclass and subclass. It's different classes. You cannot have overriding in one class. You can have overloading in one class. So you have to talk about the differences between them. Don't just give one definition and then give the other definition and assume that we'll see the difference. You need to discuss actively what those differences are. Again, next one, discuss the difference between the following code snippets. Now, with the previous one, there were 4 things that we had to look at. Method overloading, method overriding, the situation of the signature, that's 2 marks, and the situation of the class, that was 2 marks. Now this question, they're showing us 2 code snippets, but it's worth 3 marks. So something funny is going on here. So if you look at those 2 code segments, this with the brackets, super with brackets, what are those things? They are constructors. They are constructors. This constructor refers to the current instances constructor. Super constructor refers to parent classes constructor. So if you just mention that one is for the current instance, one is for superclass, okay, but there's still that 1 mark that's missing. Why is there still 1 mark that's missing? Is there something extra that goes wrong along with the superclasses? This constructor. Not really. Is there something extra going around with the superclasses constructor? Yes, there is, because your child class implicitly calls this constructor whether you like it or not. If you have a child class, it will always call at least one parent class constructor. If you don't provide a constructor, it does the default constructor, which is what we see here. There's no arguments passed here, so it's a default, no arguments constructor. Okay, now we get on to strings and regular expressions, and here you can see there's some analyze code type questions. So usually with the analyze code questions, there'll be a little code snippet. You'll have to read through it and check what is the thing that you are looking for in that situation. So here, there's 2 variables being initialized. Then there's a concatenated string where you go string plus variable plus string plus variable. And then the second one is a formatted string where we use string.format, and we create the formatted string and pass the variables as parameters to string.format. So the question states, provide the name of the string variable in the above code segment that demonstrate which approach to creating strings is more useful. Which approach to creating strings is more useful? So I just want the name. Who thinks concat string is more useful? Okay, so again, if you look at the second sub-question there, it says provide a reason for your answer. You have to give a very good reason for me to mark through here. Who says that format string is more useful? Now, how do you get to this answer? Not just by reading the code segment. You have to remember things like intern strings. So the concept of intern strings, string references in memory are kept around even if they're no longer referenced. And if you create concatenated strings like this, you're creating many of those strings in memory. Whereas if you use a formatted string, it creates less memory usage. Therefore, it's going to be more effective in the long run. Why is it more useful? Because with a concatenated string, if I have to change that string, I have to remember to change all the different pieces after each of those pluses. Whereas a formatted string, I could have that string parameter, so this thing here, in a variable, and I can change that variable whenever I want to. So here, I gave the reasons already, but it's 2 marks for just giving one of those names. And the answer, how we actually marked this, because I changed the structure of how this question is asked, how we actually marked this was as a whole. If you gave the answer and you gave a good reason for it, then you would get the marks for that specific thing. Now, if you chose the wrong one, but you gave the right reason, then we gave you marks for that. Then for B, discuss the concept of quantifiers with regards to regular expressions. So I'm not asking you to explain everything inside of regular expressions, just the quantifiers. And with quantifiers, they are used to indicate an amount of a certain character class. So you can either indicate you want it to appear once or not at all. You can give examples, etc. But all we want looking for there is to indicate an amount a character class appears. Then the last question in the strings section is going to be a regular expression, and you are going to get asked a regular expression in a similar format like this. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you exactly the same thing, but I will ask you something similar. And it says it needs to match whatever regular expression you write needs to match those things down there. Now, when we mark regular expressions, we look at things that answer the question as correct as possible. You can do something silly and just write that as the answer. It matches everything. I'm fine. But it matches more than just the examples. It matches everything. So if you answer something like this, maybe you'll get 1 mark. Maybe. But it's out of 5. So when answering a question, when you're looking at regular expressions, you will see the question usually, and I say usually because it's not guaranteed this will always be the case, usually you can separate out different pieces. There is white space between certain sections in the regular expression. Each one of those different pieces are usually worth 1 mark. And that's how we mark this specific question.
Say square brackets, then I take the first TV channel, television channel, right? And then I write it exactly as it is, each alphabet, and then I say all, and I write that, and I say all, and I
So I've seen this before. Someone takes exactly this, and then they do this whole thing like this, and they say or, and they carry on. So that's when you ask someone a question and the answer is just the words of the question rearranged, and that gives you a big fat 0, because that is not giving a regular expression that would match those things correctly. It will match only that and exactly that, but you need to make it work for maybe more than those examples. That at least it has to match that. But giving a regular expression like this, no, that's not what we asked for. Even if you go and try and optimize it, so what I've also seen is students will try and take like this. So they'll have SABC like this, and then they'll go 1, 2, 3 like that. That might get you one mark extra, 1 mark along the way, but you're still not answering the question correctly. My suggestion when you do look at this type of regular expression question, try and match everything until a space occurs. So look at the first part. What do you see that's common? Okay, I see there's uppercase letters only. So there's your first clue, what's going on. I can see there's numbers as well. Now, specifically for this, there was only numbers at the end, but it could be numbers at the start. We do look at that. If you just assume it's going to be numbers at the end, that's fine. But tricky thing that most people missed was there's a dot in ETV, and people forgot about that dot. But overall, you can see the first part of each of these things. So I do have that there. So the first part here is you're looking at capital A to Z. How many of them? We're not sure. I just put a plus because there's at least one of those characters. But you could have also just put in 0 to 9 there as well, because it can be numbers mixed in between. And then the one other thing we have to mention is that we also have that dot character that can appear. So if you leave out that dot, you still get a mark for it. But what you'll see is it will be a tick with brackets around it. We call it a part mark or partial mark. So that indicates you're answering the question almost correctly, but we give you that mark. Now this is going to be important for the rest of the marking of the question. So the first part will be that there's supposed to be a space. If you leave out that space, that's fine. We don't take that against you. We just assume that you might have forgotten that. The next part, if you look at the channels here, the frequencies, it will be some number dot some other number and then megahertz at the back there. So here, what we're looking for is /d. Now you could say 3 because most of them had 3, but there was one that wasn't. So if you say plus, that's perfectly fine. Now, because we're outside of the square brackets, you have to escape the dots because dot means something special in regular expressions. And then we got everything that appears after the dot. And then the last thing was megahertz. And then space again. And then the last thing there was the channel number, which is just like that. Now, for this would be 1 mark. This one we actually split into 2 sections. So you've got 1 mark for that and 1 mark for saying megahertz, exactly as that, no character classes around it. And then the last thing there would be for the channel. It'll give you 1 mark. So it's 1 mark, 2, 3, and 4. So that's only 4 marks. So where does your 5th mark come in? If you get each of your sections correct, as in a full tick, not a part mark, then you get your 5th and final mark. If you get one of those wrong, you lose your final mark at the end. Okay, question?
So how does it go? First, I'm seeing code of the 3 after it's very difficult. I don't know what
Yeah, so you can do that. You can, if you put your 3, that's also fine. And the last one you could also do 2. That's also fine. So you would get a full mark for that, not a problem. But I've seen cases where students will answer this and put, for some reason, 5 and 5, and it doesn't make any sense. Why would you need 5? If you put 3 in comma, that's also fine, but if you put a plus, that's the most generic one that will fit. So that's also perfectly fine. So if you look at your mark allocation and you look at your time, we talk about something called the marks per minute. How much time you should spend on a specific question. You have 60 minutes for 50 marks. So it's not exactly mark per minute, but that's what I sort of work on. If you take longer than 5 minutes to answer this question, you're taking too long. So you can do all of those things. How long is it going to take you? So that's what you need to think about. So yes, if you can come up with the right answer that way and it looks correct, I will double check it. Probably the assistant won't be able to mark it, and I'll double check it. I do go through every paper after the assistants anyway. But my suggestion when you're answering questions, look at your mark allocation. If you're spending too much time trying to figure it out, you're probably thinking about it the wrong way. Okay, so it is the end of the session. I just want to have a look at, so there's another code question here. I'm not going to analyze code question. I'm not going to look at that one. You will not get asked to do UML class diagrams this time around. So you don't have to draw a UML class diagram. You will see one in the test tomorrow, though. And for the code question, you will have to write code in some way. Now, obviously, I don't expect you to be 100% accurate. There might be syntax errors. You might put things lowercase when they should be uppercase. You might forget a semicolon. That's not what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the structure of your code. Are you actually answering the question? If I ask you to write a file, are you actually writing a file, or are you reading a file? That's what we look at.
So just out of interest, in the cold code question, it was kind of open-ended on what is string ring that identified an electron qubit would look like kind of identifiers that would use like the telescopes we did in our practical. So in this case, as long as we were consistent, whatever reference we use that we theoretically identified an electron qubit, if we were consistent, would we still get marked?
The question doesn't ask you to write the regular expression.
Oh, right, it's in the parentheses.
So make sure you read your question. The question doesn't ask you to write a regular expression. So if you wrote a regular expression in your code, it's not worth any marks. So you just wasted time. Make sure you read the question. All right, so I'll see you on at around 3 o'clock at the venue because you need to be there before D1 Lab 208. Okay, so 1B, I think that was a typo, and I didn't mention it in the test when it was in the actual venue online. So yeah, it should be for both the category and the subcategory. So question 1B should be for both the category and the subcategory. Okay, I'm going to stop.